Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Iowa Alliance for Arts Education's March webinar. Our topic tonight is travel do's and don'ts. This webinar will be in conversation about educational travel with Guy Blair and John Aboud. They are retired band directors who are currently travel consultants. With us tonight is also David Law, the Iowa Alliance for Arts Education president. He is our moderator, and I am webinar host Jennifer Gasser. This webinar series is sponsored by the Iowa Alliance for Arts Education. Its primary mission is to provide a unified message with strength in numbers, acting as one state arts education advocacy association. Provide a strong voice for arts inclusion education for the whole child. Provide and administer a mentor program for beginning arts teachers funded in part from the Iowa legislature. Provide an arts education information and professional development resources in areas current to members' needs, and provide assistance in proactive and reactive advocacy to maintain quality arts programs. This webinar is part of the Iowa Model of Excellence Mentor Program. This program is a statewide arts mentoring program to improve the quality of arts education through mentoring assistance of first-year arts teachers. You can find more information about the mentoring program on the Alliance website, which is listed on this slide. Here to introduce to you John Aboud is our moderator, David Law.
John is an outstanding music educator and now a travel consultant with a lot of experience under his belt, and he will answer any and all questions you may have, and he may tell you cool, neat junk. John.
All right. Well, let's start a little bit with travel. And when you're thinking about traveling with your group, you're going to use the rules of journalism only in reverse. You're going to go, why do you want to travel? Where do you want to travel? When do you want to travel? What do you want to do? And who are you going to include? As we start with it, I personally believe you treat every trip as a trip of a lifetime for your students, because there are going to be some of your students that will never replicate what you do on your trip on their own. So this is something that's very important, going to be very important to them in their later lives. And in your planning, it's a tremendous responsibility to keep that in mind. If they only do it once, they do it with you. You want it done right. When I talk with folks about why, I'm always, some people start with where. We want to go here. And I normally counter that with, why do you want to do that? Now, some destinations are obvious, you think, until you find out what the goals of the group are. Are you looking at, everybody's different. The idea, when I work with folks, they'll say, what's a trip to Chicago cost? And I'll look at them and say, I don't know, what does a car cost? I mean, there's so many variables. What do you want to do? And when I find out from somebody what they want to do, then we talk about places to do that at. Why do you want to travel? What do you want to do? Where are you going to go? Then the most important thing to me, and with ensembles, it's who are you going to take. So if you're going to do something to make your ensemble better, you're looking at a trip that most of those kids travel with you, the majority. There's always going to be a few that can't. And if you have a lot that can't, you've got to go back and reevaluate where you're going and what you're doing. Because if your group doesn't go with you, if you don't take the majority of your students, it's not going to come back a better ensemble. And that's what the whole goal is. At least it's always been mine. You want to come back with a better group. And if you only take a third of your group, instead of having a unifying experience through travel, you've got a dividing experience through travel. Just some basic thoughts on premise. Somebody want to direct me a bit to take the next step, or how you'd like me to go?
Do we want to go back and forth between both of you. Why don't we turn it over to Guy here and see if he has anything to add. Guy is also an extremely experienced travel coordinator, had wonderful programs, a very fine music educator, and I'll let him respond to John, and we'll kind of go back and forth, particularly with the questions that are listed there, which might be very important to new people who don't think that way.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, appreciate your comments. You're kind. I thought this was kind of interesting, just the topic that we're talking about, the do's and don'ts of travel. And you might even start with that basic, even more basic question of, do I want to travel or don't I want to travel? Because for directors, music teachers, it's a lot of work. It's an awfully lot of work. Then I thought about the do's and don'ts, and I think I'm most qualified to talk about that, because the first two trips, I stepped into a program where they had already started a travel program where they traveled every 4 years with the entire band. And so it was just kind of an expectation. And so I walk in, and luckily enough, I started teaching at Pella in 1973, and they had just gotten back from a trip to Rapid City, South Dakota. And the next trip was 4 years away. So I had some thinking time. There are a lot of things that I would do entirely different. We ended up going to the Cherry Blossom Festival. And we did that not only in 77, but in 81. And I probably made every mistake that you could make. And I'm not saying this because I work with a travel company now, but the first two trips I did on my own. And you really, I don't know, there were times I wasn't as good a teacher, you know. When you're arranging venues and talking to hotels and those people, they're kind of 8 to 5 places you're calling in, and that's when you're teaching. So I was young and dumb, but I quickly learned. But I remember the second trip we went to. Stop me if I get long with this, but it was one of those trips where everything that could go wrong went wrong. And it was back out to the Cherry Blossom Festival, and we were going to play in a mass band for the president, Ronald Reagan, at the time. As we're pulling into the outskirts of Washington, D.C., the bus driver turns to me. He said, "You won't believe this. The president's just been shot." And that's when Ronald Reagan was shot. And so there's one thing off the list. One of the major reasons we were going was going to play for the President Reagan. Another issue was we had signed up to do too many things. There was a concert band competition. We signed up for that. There was a jazz band competition. We signed up for it. There was a field show competition. We signed up for that. And plus the mass band. We get to the concert band festival, and the band that was supposed to perform at 9 o'clock was just going on at 1 o'clock when we arrived. Somebody forgot to take care of the music stands. Great judges, great performance all. That didn't work so well. Jazz band. The DC Navy Jazz Band were our clinicians. The problem was the hall was great, but the stage was really more of a stage for somebody speaking from a podium. We had kids just hanging off the sides. We get to the field show competition. It was in the tidal basin, and they had a structure set up so the judges were up, again, excellent judges. And they had a field marked. They forgot to talk with the Department of Interior because the day before they had just fertilized the tidal basin with the real stuff. We were literally marching through it. So things like that happen. And I was so excited to go to the mass band thing anyway, because Meredith Wilson was going to be conducting. It was Meredith Wilson at that stage of his life was deep in dementia, and that was kind of sad as well. So things that you think, well, if everything was perfect, it would have been a wonderful trip. Guess what? It was still a wonderful trip because of all of the things that the kids saw and all of the things that the kids did. One of the realities of trips are, and John was certainly correct here, they're memory makers. Kids, would come back from that trip, and it's one of the most vivid memories of their life. Impacted the students, and once we got back, your internet connection is unsustainable. Am I still there?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. I just had that come on, and but they will. It's so important to that. And every time I got back, I thought, when we're getting ready to go, is this really worth it? Get back, yeah, it's really worth it. And again, the why is an important part of that. I certainly agree with John there. What is the purpose of the trip? Is performance the more important purpose? Is that the reason for the trip? Basically, it comes down to this with music groups. Is that the reason for going, or is seeing different areas, seeing different places in our country or abroad, and is that the reason for it? And usually it's a combination of the two, but bands particularly, and I think choirs as well, Jennifer, you can vouch for this. You have some that are looking at the best opportunity, best performance opportunity for the student, and they measure the trip by where will that be? Where can we do that? When we got the invitation 2 different years, and in 2003 and 1988 to go to the Tournament of Roses Parade in Pasadena. Yeah, that's a big ticket, so that's an easy sell for your community. And the other venues we were able to perform at too were those kind of venues. So it was less of a clinic thing, as John was talking about, but it was, you needed all hands on deck just to be able to stand up to the pressures of the expectation for you.
Let's go ahead and kind of transition into the questions. You guys have those up on the computer in front of you?
You bet.
These are questions that I came across over the years, and some of them I came across when I was student teaching with Brizzy, and they all made sense to me after I got myself in trouble. So can you guys let's start with John, maybe talk about the first 3 things, and then have Guy kind of respond, and then we'll have Guy do the next 3, and John can respond, and we'll work through that for sure.
All right, under chaperone to student ratio, it depends what age of group and where you're going. If you're going to Disneyland, Walt Disney World, a 1-to-10 ratio is a solid ratio. If you're going to New York, and I'm talking high school groups, 1-to-8, 1-to-10, band directors, I say don't include yourself as a chaperone. You're done right. Your chaperones are in charge of the kids. You're in charge of the ensemble, and your tour director is going to take care of the trip. So if you feel as a director, well, I need to be like everybody else, I think that's an incorrect decision, because when you have to pull aside and do something that involves your position of being in charge of that band, somebody else is going to have to cover those kids. So get that taken care of right away. Under cost of chaperones, there's a variety of ways that places do it, and for a variety of reasons. Some chaperones pay just like everybody else, and they're good with that. Some are, like the chaperones will be in double rooms and they'll pay a quad rate. It's just a way of being comparable. A few places comp the chaperones, especially if they're school faculty. And the bottom line is, for everybody that goes free, your trip gets more expensive. So if you need 10 people out there at no cost, that cost is going to go somewhere, and it's going to raise the cost of your trip for your participating students, as just something to be aware of. Now there's some places that go, a chaperone going free is a gift, and you're going to have to deal with that locally. One of the issues that people get, they use chaperones, and what do you do at night? Do the chaperones do bed checks? A lot of groups anymore hire security, especially if their chaperones are paying, so that they can get some sleep. And I think that's money well spent at that capacity. Under school board limitations, that's just something you need to check with your administrator before you start and find out, what process do I have to go through to get my trip approved. Some places, you really have to do very little. You basically, as a director, you and your principal, once you're on the same page, you take it to the school board and they're going with it. Other places, they want to have more input. And if you go,
let me weigh in on that quickly before I go over to Guy. I put that in because Cedar Rapids had a continental U.S. Policy, and they still do. And occasionally some schools take cruises off of the continental U.S. So make sure that you check, because I'll put on my school board hat. When it comes to the school board, if the administration recommends approval, we say yes. So double check, double check, double check. Okay. Guy, do you have anything that you want to add to those top 3 questions?
Yeah, as far as the chaperones, my biggest problem was selection. We had more parents that wanted to go on the trip than we really could use as chaperones. We I don't know, different schools, John, as John mentioned, do it differently as far as what they expect the chaperone to pay. Our chaperones paid student rate, but half that. We took care of half the trip for the chaperone. They paid half. The reason was we wanted them to be there for a reason, and they were going to expect to do a job. Also, because of the number of parents that wanted to be chaperones, I always had a trip committee, and we had parents actually fill in an application form for the position. And we were always looking for specific things. It's good to have some medical staff on board with you. It's good to have people that have been in roles, whether it's a church youth director or been involved with students other than just their own, and can relate to kids. We had a highway patrolman on the trip once with us. I think it was a very nervous bus driver all the way out. But anyway, so just some ideas about that. But I always depended on our band parent committee to look over, eyeball those application forms and make the final selection.
I will cut in on that. When I traveled, I chose my chaperones, and I looked at parents and my booster board members that helped throughout the year. And I never felt the need to do applications just because I didn't want to turn people down. And there are a lot of ways that it can work. It's just you've got to choose one and stick with it.
Okay, let's move on to the next 3 here, and let's start with Guy. Medical supplies allowed by the state, duplicate health releases. That was for me because I was student teaching when Brisley had 1 set of forms and that bus broke down. And rooming and bus lists, when are they set in stone, etc. So Guy, would you like to take that first?
Medical supplies. I think the only medications that we had our nurse or nurses on the trip give out were things like an aspirin or Tylenol. If they had prescription meds, the nurses were always aware of what they were. And I think we did it both ways. The nurse could keep those for the students or vice versa. Duplicate health release forms, yeah. We had I think 3 different copies. Our nurse had one, or nurses. I think a student kept one with them on their person, and of course the directors had them as well. Rooming and bus lists, when are they set in stone? I think they said it's good to have that information ahead, so there's not a lot of switching at the end. So I would say enough ahead of time so that everybody's comfortable with it. If it's too far out, kids will get in an argument and won't want to room with each other by the time you go anyway. So it doesn't need to be done a little.
Okay. And John, do you have anything you want to throw in on that?
I'm going to throw a hint. The difference between rooming lists and bus lists is the rooming lists, they basically control those. The kids are going to decide who they want to room with. When I would do that, I'd just have the kids say, all right, I want to slip a paper with 4 names, and I want, make sure that the same person isn't on 3 different lists. You talk to them. Bus lists and bus seating, if you want to assign seats, that's important to kids. If you want to connect that to some sort of a target, like let's say you've got a final payment date, and when you make that payment, then you can sign up for a seat on the bus. That's something they know they're going to get to go on the bus, but they want to control where they sit. And that's something you can use in your favor as just a means of getting them to hit a deadline for you. But you need to have all this stuff a few weeks out. Because you're going to want to have the rooming list of the hotels. No, the bus lists are just internal. One of the things I used to do with bus lists is I would identify the buses like A, B, C, and when the kids signed up, but I wouldn't let them, all they'd see on the front is where they'd see seats assigned for chaperones. They wouldn't know who the chaperones were or what bus they were signing up for, and I made those determinations later.
Okay. The one thing I would throw in is after Brizzy had the bus breakdown with the health forms, the one set of health forms, he and then I did from then on always had a master set at home with a parent who was going to be pretty much available all the time, preferably someone with a health background. And then we also got a little paranoid and had a complete set of health releases on every single bus. That may be overdoing it, but you don't want to get trapped having to take a kid to the hospital and have no release or form or medication or anything else. Also, medical supplies allowed by the state of Iowa. I'll put my school board member hat on again. If you don't have a health professional with you, or even somebody with at least a coaching certification, make sure you know what you are not allowed to do. You cannot give a kid an aspirin. You cannot use latex gloves because you don't know who's allergic. So be very careful if you don't have a health professional in that situation. Okay, John, let's let you continue on. Chaperones linked by phone numbers for texts for checking in, bring along an administrator or guidance counselor, and what cost, and what are your payment deadlines?
Okay. There are a number of ways that you can communicate on cell phones anymore. Having a group text for your chaperones to communicate with them is an effective way of doing it. And then phone, because you can't do group calls necessarily and catch everybody, but texting is a good way to communicate with your chaperones and have them communicate with their kids that same way. Whether or not you bring along an administrator or guidance counselor, that's your call. I mean, do you need them? Are they going to help you? Now, some districts are going to say you should have one of these people with you. Now, here's the deal. If you bring the administrator, who's in charge of the trip? Those parameters need to be established ahead of time. Same thing with the guidance counselor. I mean, they're there in a support mode, not as, they have a different hat when they do that traveling. If you're bringing them along, if you have to have that administrator, there should be, that should come at a, I would say, if your school district says you need to take an administrator on your trip, I would expect the administrators to fund that. I would expect that to be a budget item somewhere else that the band wouldn't have, or the choir wouldn't have to pay for if it's required. And realistically, the money does exist. Under payment deadlines, normally everything has got to be done. You're going to have final payments coming due 3 months in advance of your trip. And some, you're going to have deposits. So you're going to have to sit down and work with your travel planner. And I just want to back up for a second about that. When I started traveling, when Guy started traveling, there weren't travel companies that specialize in music performance travel like there are now. And we both started doing this stuff because we didn't have any choice if we wanted to travel. There are options. And as Guy said, doing a trip as a teacher gets in the way with your teaching. Payment deadlines, you're going to have to work with your travel provider on that. You want to, your trip needs to be set the spring of the year prior. I should say needs to. Strongly recommend that students go into the summer vacation, summer break, knowing what their trip is going to be and what it's going to cost. Because discretionary spending is heaviest in the summer. If they know they need to set that money aside, they can do that versus finding out in the fall. Whether or not you want to make payments then, that's your choice. The challenge with making payments is then you have to monitor them. And it's, if you're going to ask for payments made during the summer, do you have the means of keeping track of your kids? Or do some places see them off and on all summer? Some don't see them for 2 months. June hits and they're done, and it's like, see you in August for band camp or end of July, whatever it is. So if you have payments going on in that interim, and somebody doesn't make them, what's going to be your methodology? Something to work with your travel consultant with.
Okay, Guy, do you have extra stuff to put in?
I really don't. Johnny covered it pretty well. I can't remember a time when I didn't have an administrator on the trip, but the administrator was on the trip as a chaperone. And that administrator had a kid in our band, So they were at the same cost that the other chaperones were, and their responsibilities were the same as the other chaperones. So they weren't a different designation. I always liked it when the administrator was long, and I always felt I was always happy when they were there. So there were times we did, but I would say more trips than not, we had an administrator with us because they were a chaperone on the trip and serving in the same role as they were. Yeah, as far as payment deadlines, I know our travel company sets them up in accordance with what the director's wishes are as much as possible. But yeah, those deadlines, I think 3 months ahead, like John said, is good. As far as how far ahead to plan that trip, I can remember we used to do it the year of. And when we went to Trinidad Roses the first year, we knew a year and a couple months out that we were going to that. And we were making plans for that far ahead of time. And I don't care if it's Trinidad Roses, wherever we're going. From then on, that's at least a year ahead of time. Make your life a lot easier.
I'd like to talk a little bit about payments.
Yeah, go ahead.
How you're going to collect money. There are a number of companies, and ours is one of them, that if the students are making payments, individually, they can pay the company direct. That does take the responsibility off of the teachers for collecting the dollars, cataloging the dollars, turning in the dollars, which has become an onerous process anymore due to people that do it incorrectly and have embezzled. If you're going to collect money from kids, and if that's how your school district wants you to do it, you need to budget some time to do that, because you are going to have, it's a strict accounting. You don't want to have money in your office at the end of the day. And it's something you need to think about and have conversations with as to how you're going to collect money for the travel.
John's right. I never collected money. Luckily, I always had a parent that was, and of course, when they want to give you money, they're going to bring it along to rehearsal. I always had a parent that was in charge of the money, and they were there during rehearsal, and they took care of the accounting and collection of the money. And they were bonded.
And let me just put in, from a school board standpoint, the auditors are absolutely all over the school boards. Nobody counts money by themselves. In fact, they recommend 3 people counting the money in any situation for activity accounts, lunch accounts, etc. And that's kind of excessive, but that's where school districts are headed, and Guy had it right, because there have been enough embezzlement cases that it's a problem. Let me move on to the next one, and we'll throw this to John. This was my own thing. I had a student who had some severe health problems, and the parents wanted to know how long it would take to get to the nearest hospital from the hotel, etc. So again, that seems a little paranoid, but it did come up once. And are there any bus driver limitations that the coordinator should know other than the tour director? I mean, can they only drive 20 hours or whatever? And then let's talk about a bed check procedure. So John, you're up.
Under hospitals to hotels, that's something that your company is going to take care of, and your tour guide is going to know. And as for means of getting in emergencies, that one is going to get played by ear. There's ambulances, there's Ubers. The bus drivers are aware of their hour limitations that they can do a day. So that's not I wouldn't call that that's not a question I give a specific answer. That one would be played by ear, knowing what you had to do. But the drivers have certain hours they can do a day, and they know what those are. If you hire somebody to design your trip, they know what those are to make sure that they stay within those limitations. Bed check. This is done a variety of ways. Normally, it's one of your chaperone responsibilities, is that they are assigned rooms, and they physically check, and it's like see them, touch them. You got to see. We always joke, when you take something, you're not going to touch kids, but you need to literally see every kid. Males check males, females check females, and it's not good enough that Jill is in the bathroom. You have to see Jill. So that part is there. I recommend the nighttime security, just because you have somebody now that's paid to stay up at night and walk the halls. And you're taking good kids. Good kids do have it. There is always an element of stupid with your group. And if that's kind of your smart kids look and go, we're not going to mess with this. We've got security out in the halls. If somebody says, hey, versus the kids that go, let's see if we can fool Mrs. Brown. She always falls asleep in her chair, watching the halls. So something to think about. But again, part of it is, if you've got to worry about them a lot, you're probably not back to why are you taking this trip. So I'll let Guy go ahead from there.
Okay.
Yeah, I got nothing to add.
Well, in the old days, and the reason I threw that in was in the old days, there was like putting Scotch tape over the door frame to see if the door had been opened, and all the silly things that used to be done. So that's kind of why that's in. Let's kind of wrap up these questions anyhow, and then I'll give each one of you guys a chance to throw in whatever else we didn't cover. But what kind of school rules in effect? Is it kind of all state rules? What do you recommend from your point as a professional?
What do you want?
Guy, go ahead.
Okay. I had a rule that, as far as kids being in each other's rooms or mixed gender in rooms, I didn't follow the all-state rule. I was fine with it. I had a simple rule that students would never be in groups of less than, let's say, 3. You know, and you think about that, it sounds like it's easy enough rule. Unless they were into something really kinky, you know, 3 people is a good number of people to have together. And I don't care whether that's was in the room or in a park or whatever. You were always in groups of never less than 3. So that was my rule. It was simple.
Okay, John?
I think, I don't think you have a lot of choice in some of this. If it's a school function, usually school rules concerning substance abuse and everything else follow you there. So that's going to be in effect. Now, when I traveled, again, I talk about the chaperones are in charge of the kids. I mean, and I found that I didn't want to hear about problems unless they couldn't deal with them. Chaperones are much more flexible than teachers are in dealing with issues. And it's going to save you a lot of grief if they can take care of things for you. And trust their judgment, because you've already trusted them by putting them in the role. But if a kid gets caught drinking or so on, you've probably already got a protocol in place as to what you're going to do with it. All state rules, I mean, I personally I'm going just to keep it clean. Guys are in guys' room, girls are in girls' rooms, and never the two shall meet. And I didn't give them a lot of time in the hotel to have that be an issue. So my thoughts on that.
That's pretty much what I expected. What I wanted to put some of these in here was for first-time people who are going out on a big trip, just general reminders to make sure they're checking every box with professionals like both of you. And we both know that some people prefer to plan their own, and you guys have done that in the past too. My personal recommendation is pay a professional to take care of this stuff so that you don't get yourself in trouble. Let's do a kind of a final wrap up here, and let's start with John. Do you have any thoughts that you want to cover that we didn't cover?
Yes, I want to talk about cost. When you contract a trip, or it's quite often called a tour agreement, that dollar figure is going to reflect a number of students over a trip cost. And you're going to come up with a per person cost. Be aware that if your numbers go down, the common costs of a tour director, the buses, don't change. So those costs get spread over your trip, and the individual prices are going to go up. So do not do pie in the sky. Be realistic about who's going to travel. Have your conversations ahead of time, because nothing's going to get you into bigger trouble than for people to find out you shot them one price, and because you grossly underestimated or overestimated the number of people that were going to participate, all of a sudden the trip just went up $200 or $300. And that can happen. So do not, be honest with your travel provider, do your homework, talk to your kids. And that's one of the reasons you have penalties sometimes, on collecting money. But that's the biggest problem. I shouldn't say the biggest problem, but one of the big problems that teachers deal with. They misguess how many are going to go. They don't do their homework correctly, and that price keeps going up. And then what happens is it escalates, because if it gets too high, then a couple more drop out. And next thing you know, your trip may not happen for you. So be very conscious of that and be realistic. when you plan your trip, be wary. There are different companies out there. Some will give you an incredible price. You'll contract, you say, I'm going, I love your price. And then as you start evolving with your trip and talking about what you want built into that trip, it's kind of like, oh, did you want beds in your room? That's another cost. You can get chipped, and again, you can watch your price climb on that. You want to work with somebody that gives you all the inclusions you want on the front end. You need to know those prices when you start. And again, like I said, the terminology in the business is a tour agreement. Think of that as a contract. I'm with Guy. I use the rule of 3 for everything we did. I told the kids, if I lose 3 of you, I'm good, but I don't want to lose 1. And 3 is a great rule. If there's a problem, there's someone to give help and someone to get help. So if you stay with that. Okay, we'll let Guy, anything I've missed?
Yeah, I think you covered it very well. It's one of the things when you're I would always encourage to go over those contracts with a fine-tooth comb. If you're working with a particular travel company, Bob Riser Travel probably doesn't want me to say it's a good idea to compare travel companies, but I always did. I just, but when you are doing that, make sure it's apples to apples, not apples to oranges, because the basic things that will determine the cost of that trip and why the prices will vary from company to company are based on a couple of things. Where you're staying, the price of the hotel you're staying at, and the venues, where you're going and what you're doing. And all of those kinds of things. So make sure it's, look those over well and research what's on that itinerary so that you know that you're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges.
There are 2 types of trips that are put out there by companies. One is an itinerary-based trip. The other is an inclusion-based trip. And an inclusion-based trip is one that just lists, this is what you're going to do when you're comparing. And the itinerary-based trip is going to show you how it's going to fit in. I strongly recommend you look at those. Inclusions are as simple as when you look at that and you go, okay, we're doing a dinner boat ride or a riverboat ride. Are we doing it at lunch? We're doing a meal in a riverboat. Is this a lunch cruise or a dinner cruise? If you've got 2 different proposals from 2 different companies, that is going to be a different price. If you're doing a show, hey, what are you budgeting for tickets? And because some people can come in and they'll get you in the theater and that's all they'll get you, but it'll look better on the front end. So ask questions, and realistically if you have a couple tour companies that you're looking at, share the proposals. It's not private. There's a lot of belief that, this is confidential information, but this is all going to be public. It's a public document, what you sign as a contract. So share and make sure you're getting the right information and making the right decision.
Okay, I would like to just wrap up a little bit to the people who will be viewing this. Both of our gentlemen tonight are absolutely outstanding music educators, but the trip rules we're talking about go for dance, go for any time you're taking any sort of trip with students, speech, etc. It's that they've been there, they've done it all, they know what's going on. Make sure that you feel comfortable contacting them if you need to. But we hope that this has been informative, and I really appreciate the time and the expertise, and I will pass this back to Jen.
Thanks. Yes, I hope everyone has enjoyed this webinar tonight with us. Thanks to our presenters, John and Guy, and thank you to David and Robert for being here as well. If you would like to join us for our next webinar, part of our next series in April is Tips for Festival Seasons, speech, drama, music, and visual arts. And finally, again, you can find the recording of this webinar on the Iowa Alliance for Arts Education website. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Good night.